5 collectors, 1 underground vault, 10 seconds of darkness, and when the lights came back on, one of them was dead. This is not a story about technology. It's a story about ownership. The Closed Auction. Prologue. The Vault. The elevator did not display floors. It displayed depth. A small digital panel above the doors counted downward in meters, not numbers, each decrement accompanied by a soft mechanical hum that suggested the building did not like being reminded how far underground it went. Edward Hale watched the digits descend with quiet interest, feeling the subtle pressure change in his ears, the barely perceptible tightening in his chest. This was not a place designed for people to arrive accidentally. The bank tower above them was all glass and reassurance, its public spaces filled with soft lighting, polite security, and the curated silence of money behaving itself. What lay beneath it was different. What lay beneath had no interest in comfort. The elevator slowed. The panel stopped at -47 meters. The doors did not open immediately. Edward noticed this. Doors that opened immediately trusted you. Doors that paused were checking something. Finally, with a sound like a decision being made, the doors slid apart. The vault corridor waited. It was wider than Edward expected, tall enough to feel ceremonial, lined with concrete polished to a dull sheen that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The walls were unadorned, save for narrow black seams that marked where sensors, cameras, and systems hid behind the surface. Nothing protruded, nothing invited touch. At the far end stood a single door, not steel, composite, matte black without visible hinges, its surface broken only by a recessed panel that glowed faintly, as if breathing. Edward stepped out. The elevator doors closed behind him with finality. For a moment he was alone. He did not mind that. The door opened as he approached, reacting not to proximity, but to confirmation. Somewhere above, credentials were checked, names matched, expectations aligned. Inside, the vault was already occupied. 5 people stood around a circular table set into the floor like an altar. The table itself was unremarkable, dark, smooth, almost intentionally boring, but what hovered above it was not. A holographic projection pulsed slowly in the air, an abstract geometric form, constantly shifting yet never changing, its edges resolving and dissolving in a way that suggested permanence rather than motion. The artifact. Edward felt the room respond to his presence. Not hostile, curious. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward him, each assessing him through their own private lens of value and threat. Edward took them in without hurry. Closest to the projection stood a man in his early 50s, immaculate without being flashy, his suit tailored to suggest effortlessness rather than expense. His posture was relaxed, but his hands were folded too carefully, fingers interlaced as if to restrain movement. Victor Klein, Edward knew, venture capitalist, early crypto adopter, the kind of man who believed risk was something that happened to other people. To Klein's right stood a woman whose wealth was worn like armor, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. She watched the artifact with a proprietary intensity as if it dared to resist her. Isabella Moreau, private collector, patron of digital art, known for acquiring things not because they were valuable, but because others wanted them. Opposite her, leaning slightly against the table, was a younger man whose casual posture felt studied. His jacket was open, his tie absent, his expression carefully neutral. Leonard Cho, crypto security specialist, publicly skeptical of NFTs, privately involved in nearly every major private sale. Near the edge of the room, hands clasped behind his back, stood an older gentleman with silver hair and a measured gaze that missed nothing. He did not look at the artifact. He looked at the people. Arthur Bell, trustee, facilitator, the man whose job it was to ensure that whatever happened here would remain discreet. And finally, seated slightly apart, was the fifth participant, a woman in her 40s, her expression calm to the point of detachment, fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her chair. She did not look at the artifact either. She looked at the floor, as if counting something invisible. Dr. Helena Weiss, cryptographer, the one who had designed the transfer protocol that made this auction possible. Edward saved her for last. Arthur Bell spoke first, his voice carrying easily in the controlled acoustics of the vault. "Mr. Hale, thank you for joining us." He inclined his head. "Thank you for the invitation," Edward replied. Bell gestured toward an empty space at the table. "As agreed, you are here as an observer," Bell said. Edward nodded. "That's correct." Isabella Moreau's eyes flicked toward him. "An observer," she repeated softly, "or insurance." Edward met her gaze calmly. "Those roles often overlap," he said. A faint smile touched her lips, but it did not reach her eyes.
The door sealed behind Edward with a sound that was not loud, but definitive. Arthur Bell continued. "Before we proceed," he said, "I'll remind everyone of the terms. This is a closed auction. No devices, no external communication. All transfer protocols are isolated and air-gapped. The artifact exists here and only here until ownership is resolved." Leonard Cho snorted quietly. "Ownership," he said, a charming word. Bell ignored him. "The lights will be dimmed during the final verification," Bell said. "This is standard procedure. 10 seconds, no movement, no interaction." Edward's attention sharpened slightly at that. 10 seconds. Short enough to seem harmless, long enough to matter. Dr. Weiss finally looked up. "The blackout is necessary," she said, her voice precise. "The protocol requires a clean reset of visual tracking to ensure that the private key transfer cannot be intercepted." Isabella tilted her head. "You mean," she said, "we turn off the lights so no one can see anything?" Weiss met her gaze. "So the system can see everything," she said. Edward made a note of the phrasing. The auction began. Bids were not shouted. They were entered quietly, each participant interacting with a private interface embedded into the table. Numbers appeared in the air briefly, then vanished, leaving only the artifact pulsing steadily, indifferent to the escalating value being projected onto it. Edward watched the people instead. Klein's breathing had changed, slightly faster now, anticipatory. Moreau's fingers tapped the table, once, twice, then stilled. Cho leaned closer to the projection, eyes narrowing as if trying to see behind it. Bell watched them all, his expression unreadable. Weiss watched the countdown. The room felt heavy, not with tension exactly, with expectation. Edward had felt this before, in rooms where too much value was concentrated too tightly, places where people forgot that ownership was a story agreed upon collectively, not a law of nature. Bell spoke again. "Final verification," he said. The lights dimmed, then went out. Darkness in the vault was complete. Not a soft dimming, not an ambient glow. Absolute. Edward felt it immediately, the way the room seemed to shrink without light, how sound became suddenly enormous. He heard a sharp intake of breath, a chair shifting, fabric brushing against fabric. 10 seconds was a long time in the dark. Edward counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Someone exhaled too loudly. 4, 5. A faint metallic sound, not loud, not obvious. 6, 7. The smell of ozone, brief and sharp. 8, 9.
Edward stopped counting. The lights came back on. For a heartbeat, nothing made sense. The artifact hovered as it had before, unchanged. The people stood where they had been. Then Isabella Moreau screamed. Victor Klein lay on the floor. His body was twisted slightly, one arm bent beneath him at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in an expression of confusion rather than pain. There was no blood, no visible wound, but his eyes were open, and he was very clearly dead. Chaos erupted, restrained only by the vault itself. Bell moved first, kneeling beside Klein, fingers hovering uselessly above him. "He's not breathing! Lights! Lockdown!" Dr. Weiss was already moving, her face pale, eyes darting to the projection above the table. "No," she said, "the artifact!" She stopped. The projection flickered, then vanished. Edward felt the shift in the room. Not panic, realization. Cho stepped back slowly. "That's impossible," he said. "The transfer didn't complete." Weiss stared at the empty space above the table. "The key," she whispered. "The private key." Moreau rounded on her. "You lost it," Moreau hissed. "You said this was secure." Weiss looked up, her composure cracking for the first time. "It was," she said. "It was." Edward stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I suggest no one moves." They all turned toward him. Edward looked at the dead man on the floor, then at the empty air where the artifact had been. "One of you," Edward continued, "used 10 seconds of darkness to do 2 things." Silence. Edward finished the thought. "You kill the man," he said, "and you stole something that no one here can afford to lose." The vault felt smaller now. The door remained sealed. The lights burned steadily, and somewhere in the building systems, ownership had already changed. Edward Hale looked around the circle of faces, each now stripped of performance, each reacting not to the murder, but to the theft. He made his first conclusion quietly. The murder was not the point. It was the cover. Chapter 1. 5 Bitters. When the room settled, it did so reluctantly. Silence returned in layers, each one thinner than the last, like dust refusing to fall evenly. The vault systems had done what they were designed to do: lock doors, stabilize lighting, restore order. But order did not mean calm, it meant containment. Edward Hale stood where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, letting the others move first. In situations like this, motion was confession before words ever were. Arthur Bell knelt beside Victor Klein's body, fingers hovering just above the man's neck, then pulling back as if remembering protocol at the last second. He did not touch. That was telling. Bell was a trustee. His instincts were fiduciary, not human. "He's dead," Bell said quietly, not as a question, not as an alarm, a statement entered into the room like a clause into a contract. Isabella Moreau backed away until she reached the wall, one hand pressed flat against it, as if expecting it to move. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were sharp, flicking between the body and the empty space above the table where the artifact had hovered. Leonard Cho stood with his hands slightly raised, palms open, the universal posture of someone who wanted to look cooperative without actually committing to anything. His breathing was steady, too steady. Dr. Helena Weiss remained frozen near her chair, eyes locked on the table, her mouth slightly open as if she had been interrupted mid-crisis. Edward took a slow step forward. "No one leaves this room." His voice was calm, unhurried. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The vault itself reinforced him. Bell looked up at him. "The vault is already sealed. It will remain so until external authorization is good. Then we're all on the same page." Bell's eyes narrowed slightly. He was not used to being interrupted. Trustees were rarely. Edward turned his attention to the body.
Victor Klein lay on his side now, Bell having shifted slightly when he knelt. His chute jacket was creased where his shoulder had hit the floor. His tie sat crooked, as if he had adjusted it reflexively in the dark. There was no blood, no visible trauma. His expression remained oddly neutral, the face of a man whose last thought had not yet caught up with his situation. Edward crouched, careful not to touch. "Does anyone have medical training?" Edward asked. Dr. Weiss swallowed. "Basic," she said. "Occupational requirements." Edward nodded. "And did anyone hear him fall?" Edward asked. They exchanged glances. "No," Cho said. "There was too much—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Confusion." Edward accepted that. In 10 seconds of darkness, sound becomes unreliable. He straightened. "Let's begin simply. We were 5 bidders. Now we are 4. Before we talk about the artifact, we talk about Victor Klein." Isabella Moreau let out a sharp laugh. "You think it's about him? He's collateral." Edward looked at her.
Edward looked at her. "Everything is collateral," he said, "until someone decides it isn't." Edward gestured toward the table. "Take your seats," he said. "All of you." Bell hesitated, then nodded, motioning for the others to comply. They took their places slowly, leaving Klein's body where it lay, an unspoken acknowledgment that none of them wanted to be the one who moved him again. Edward remained standing. "Before the lights went out," Edward said, "each of you was here for a reason, not just to buy something, to prove something, to yourselves, if not to each other." He turned first to Arthur Bell. "Mr. Bell," Edward said, "you're not a bidder." Bell inclined his head. "I'm not." "You're a trustee," Edward said, "a facilitator." "Yes." "Your role," Edward continued, "is to ensure discretion, continuity, that what happens here does not become public knowledge." Bell's jaw tightened. "Within the limits of legality." Edward nodded. "Of course." He paused. "And when the lights went out," Edward said, "where were you?" Bell did not hesitate. "Here," he said, "at my position." Edward nodded. "And did you move?" Edward asked. Bell met his gaze evenly. "No." Edward let the answer sit without comment. He turned to Leonard Cho. "Mr. Cho," Edward said, "you are not here to buy art." Cho smiled faintly. "Art is a generous word." "You're here," Edward continued, "because you understand systems, security, failure modes." Cho shrugged. "Someone has to." Edward nodded. "You've publicly criticized private NFT auctions," Edward said, "called them theater." Cho's smile tightened. "Publicly, yes." "And privately?" Edward asked. Cho's eyes flicked briefly toward the empty space above the table. "Privately," he said, "I respect good theater." Edward nodded. "And during the blackout?" Edward asked. Cho spread his hands. "I didn't move," he said. "You can check the footage." Edward glanced toward Bell. "There is no footage during the blackout," Edward said. Cho's smile faded. Edward turned to Isabella Moreau. "Ms. Moreau," Edward said, "you collect things." She laughed again, sharper this time. "I curate," she said. Edward nodded. "You acquire items others want, sometimes more for the wanting than the item itself." "And," she asked, "and Victor Klein was your primary competitor tonight," Edward said. Her expression did not change. "He was, and now he's not." Edward watched her carefully. "When the lights went out," Edward said, "what did you do?" She lifted her chin. "I stayed exactly where I was. I don't grope around in the dark like an amateur." Edward nodded. "And did you touch anyone?" Her eyes flashed. "No." Edward did not react. Finally, he turned to Dr. Helena Weiss. "Dr. Weiss," Edward said, "you designed the protocol." She nodded faintly. "The private key," Edward said, "was never physically present here."
No, only the mechanism for transfer. Edward nodded. And when the lights went out? Edward asked. She hesitated. I monitored the system by feel. Edward tilted his head slightly. By feel? She flushed. The interface responds to pressure, she said. I kept my hand on the table. Edward made a note of that. And did you remove your hand? Edward asked. No, no, not intentionally. Edward nodded. He stepped back, giving them space to breathe. We'll come back to the blackout, Edward said. For now, I want to talk about Victor Klein. He gestured toward the body. Victor Klein believed in first-mover advantage, in getting there before anyone else understood the game. Cho nodded. That's accurate.
He was early in crypto, Edward continued. Early in private acquisitions. Early in treating digital scarcity as real. Isabella scoffed softly. And that made him sloppy, Edward said. Her eye snapped to him. Sloppy? She repeated. Edward nodded. He believed speed was protection, he said, that being ahead made him untouchable. Bell frowned. Where are you going with this? Edward answered without looking at him. To motive, he said. Edward walked slowly around the table. Klein had already secured access to the private P, Edward said. The room reacted instantly. Weiss's head snapped up. Cho's posture stiffened. Moreau's hand tightened against the wall. That's impossible, Weiss said. The key was never stored here, Edward finished. Yes, but ownership is not the same as possession. He stopped behind Cho. Klein knew the auction was theater, Edward said, that the real transfer happens when people believe it does. Cho's jaw tightened. You're speculating, Cho said. Edward nodded. Of course I am, but speculation explains behavior. He turned to Moreau. Klein wasn't bidding against you, Edward said. He was provoking you. Her lips parted slightly. And when the lights went out, Edward continued, someone realized the truth. He paused. And someone decided the truth was too expensive. Edward returned to the center of the room. The blackout wasn't for theft, Edward said. The theft had already happened. Bell shook his head. That's not possible. Edward met his gaze. It is if the blackout was for confirmation, Edward said, not action. Silence followed. Edward looked at each of them in turn. In 10 seconds of darkness, Edward said, one of you learned something you couldn't afford to let anyone else learn. He glanced at Klein's body. And he paid for knowing it first. Edward concluded the chapter quietly. 5 bidders came into this vault, he said. 4 will leave. He looked at the sealed door. The question, Edward said, is not who killed Victor Klein. He let the words settle. It's who realized he was already too late. Chapter 2. 10 seconds. 10 seconds sounded harmless when you said it out loud. It was a fragment, a blink, the kind of duration people wasted on reaching for a glass of water or scrolling without thinking. It was short enough to dismiss, short enough to underestimate, short enough to hide inside the phrase standard procedure. But in a sealed room with 5 people and 1 prize, 10 seconds became an entire world. Edward Hale knew that time did not behave the same way in darkness. In darkness, time was not measured by clocks. It was measured by breath, by the friction of fabric, by the small betrayals of bodies that no longer had light to discipline them. He stood beside the table and looked at the 4 survivors. "We're going to relive those 10 seconds," Edward said calmly. No one spoke. Edward continued, not emotionally, not theatrically, mechanically. Arthur Bell swallowed. "This is absurd," he said. "We should call—" "The bank's security will arrive when the bank decides it is safe," Edward replied. "And when they arrive, they will want a story that protects the bank." Bell's jaw tightened. Edward looked at him. "I want the story that happened," Edward said. "Those are rarely the same." Edward approached the vault door. It was sealed, no gaps, no handles. A bank vault was a declaration, your will does not matter here. Only authorization did. He returned to the circle. Before the blackout, Edward said, all of you were positioned around the table. The artifact was visible. The interfaces were active. The room was normal. He paused. Then the blackout went out, he said. He glanced at Dr. Helena Weiss. You said the blackout is required for reset, 10 seconds. Weiss nodded tightly. Yes. And during those 10 seconds, Edward said, no one is supposed to move. That's correct, Bell said. Edward nodded. And yet, he said, a man died and the key vanished. The room tightened again, as if their muscles remembered the dark. Edward opened his notebook. He did not write much. He had already written the essential detail that mattered more than any accusation. Someone made a sound. He looked up. I heard 3 things in the blackout, and I would like to know which of you is going to explain them. Cho scoffed softly. You can't possibly. Edward raised his hand. 1, Edward said, a chair shift. 2, a faint metallic contact. 3, ozone. Silence. Isabella Moreau's eyes narrowed. Ozone? Edward nodded. Brief, he said. Sharp. Weiss looked uneasy now. That could be the table interface, she said quickly. High voltage reset. Edward regarded her. It could, he agreed, but if it's normal, you'll have no problem showing me the equipment that produces it. Weiss did not answer. Edward turned to Bell. Mr. Bell, Edward said, your chair is the only one with a different base. Bell frowned. Because it's a trustee chair, he said, fixed for stability. Edward nodded. And did it shift? Bell's eyes flashed. No. Edward held his gaze for a moment longer, then moved on. Let's do this properly, Edward said. He stepped to the table's edge. Everyone, he said, stand exactly where you were when the blackout began. They hesitated. People always did when asked to recreate their own vulnerability. Then, one by one, they complied. Bell moved first, taking his position near the vault door side of the table. His posture was erect, hands clasped behind his back as before. Cho moved next, leaning slightly, one hip near the table's edge, as if he couldn't help performing casualness. Moreau stood opposite, near the wall, her body angled toward the projection's former position. Weiss sat, or rather hovered, at her chair, hand resting on the table where she claimed the pressure interface was. Edward studied the geometry. Distances, angles, lines of movement. In light, it was obvious. In darkness, it would become chaos. Now, Edward said, tell me what you did in the blackout. Not what you think you did, what you actually did. Cho scoffed softly. How would we know? Edward looked at him. Because your bodies know. They did it. You were just there. He pointed at Weiss. Dr. Weiss, your hand was on the interface. Weiss nodded. Yes.
Did you press anything? Edward asked. No, she said quickly. No, the reset happens automatically. Edward nodded. But you kept pressure, Edward said. To feel it. Weiss swallowed. Yes. Edward wrote, one hand occupied. He turned to Bell. Mr. Bell, Edward said, what did you do? Nothing, Bell replied. Edward nodded. You didn't reach for a phone, you didn't touch the wall, you didn't step. Bell's eyes narrowed. No. Edward wrote, hands behind back, claimed. He turned to Moreau. Miss Moreau. I stayed still, she said, chin raised. I don't flail. Edward nodded. But you screamed when the lights returned. Moreau's eyes flashed. Because there was a corpse. Edward nodded. Yes, but the scream came first. You saw the body before anyone else reacted. Silence. Moreau's jaw tightened. Edward wrote, position gave first line of sight. He turned to Cho. Mr. Cho? Cho spread his hands. I didn't move, he said. And even if I did, what could I do in 10 seconds? Edward smiled faintly. Quite a lot, he said, if you knew what you were doing. Cho's smile vanished. Edward walked to where Victor Klein had been standing. He marked the spot mentally. near the table's left quadrant, close enough to reach the interface, far enough to appear relaxed. He had been the type to stand as if ownership was already decided. Edward looked down at the floor. No blood, no obvious wound, but there were small details, a faint scuff mark, a slight smear that could have been shoe rubber. Something had shifted weight suddenly. Edward crouched and stared. "Tell me," Edward said quietly, "did anyone hear him speak in the blackout?" No one answered. Edward nodded. Because he didn't have time. He reconstructed the blackout in his head. The lights go out. Instant darkness. The nervous system spikes. People's bodies respond before their minds do. The first second is breath. The second is tension. The third is motion. Edward had counted. He remembered. At around the fourth second, someone had exhaled too loudly. He looked at Belle. Belle's face remained controlled. Edward looked at Cho. Cho's breathing was steady now, but it had been steady earlier, too. Edward looked at Weiss. Her throat moved slightly as she swallowed. Edward looked at Moreau. She held herself as if anger could keep fear away. Edward made a decision. "We will simulate it," Edward said. Belle stiffened. "Absolutely not." Edward looked at him. "Then we will never know if you're lying." Belle's lips pressed together. Edward continued calmly. "The bank will simulate it later anyway, with security teams, with forensic lighting, with their own narrative. This is your only chance to have the truth not edited." Belle hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. The vault lights dimmed again. Weiss's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Edward's voice remained calm. 10 seconds. No movement, no touching, no speaking. He looked at each of them. "And if you do, I will notice." The lights went out. Darkness returned, thick and absolute. Edward counted silently. 1. The room breathed. 2. Someone's clothing shifted, almost inaudible. 3. A chair creaked. 4. A faint metallic contact, small, sharp. 5. A brief crackle, like static. 6. The scent of ozone, clean and sharp, hit Edward's nose. 7. A soft, controlled exhale. 8. A scrape, barely. 9. Edward's mind locked onto one certainty. 10. The lights returned. All 4 survivors stood rigid, but Edward saw what light revealed instantly. Moreau's left hand was not where it had been. It hovered slightly away from her side, fingers curled as if she had reached for something and stopped herself mid-act. She noticed his gaze. "I adjusted my sleeve," she snapped. Edward nodded. "Maybe," he said. Weiss's eyes flicked toward the table's underside, then away. Cho blinked too fast, too often. Belle's shoulders were subtly raised, as if he had been holding his breath too long. Edward did not accuse. Not yet. Accusation was crude. He wanted cause. Edward stepped to the table interface and ran his gloved fingers along the edge, feeling for seams. He found one. A shallow groove. A concealed panel. He pressed gently. Nothing. Weiss spoke quickly. "It won't open without authorization." Edward looked at her. "And does authorization reset during a blackout?" Edward asked. Weiss hesitated. It temporarily unlocks some functions," she admitted, "to reinitialize." Edward nodded slowly. 10 seconds, he murmured, long enough for a system to forget who you are. He pulled his hand back. Ozone. The table did produce it, but ozone was not the problem. It was the cover. Edward moved toward the spot where Victor Klein fell. He looked at the line between that spot and the table's underside. He imagined a hand reaching under cover of darkness, a small device, a quick action, something that could disable a man without leaving visible injury. Not poison in a drink, not a knife, something modern, silent, plausible. Edward spoke quietly.
Klein didn't die because someone attacked him in the dark, Edward said. They stared at him. He died, he continued, because someone used the dark to trigger something that was already waiting. Cho scoffed. Like what? Edward looked at him. Like the moment he realized the key was gone, Edward said. Silence. Weiss's face went pale. Moreau's lips parted. Bell's eyes narrowed. Cho stopped smiling entirely. Edward saw it then. The murder and the theft were linked by one thing: knowledge. The blackout wasn't for stealing. It was for forcing the truth to surface in the only moment no one could be watched. Edward closed his notebook. 10 seconds, he said softly, is enough to do almost nothing physically. He looked around the circle. But, he said, it's enough to make a human being reveal what they know. He paused. And someone here, he added, revealed too much.
Chapter 3. The Key. Edward Hale had learned early in his career that people misunderstood what keys were. They imagined teeth and grooves, metal and locks, something you could hold and lose and drop down a drain. Even in the digital age, that intuition lingered. A key was still thought of as an object, something there. In reality, keys were agreements. The vault had not been built to protect an object. It had been built to protect a moment, the moment when ownership changed hands and everyone agreed to pretend that this moment was inevitable rather than engineered. Edward stood beneath the dead space where the hologram had hovered and addressed the room again. Nothing physical was stolen, he said, and yet something is gone. Arthur Bell exhaled slowly, as if restraining irritation. The private key was never displayed, Bell said. It was never stored here. The protocol is a ritual, Edward finished calmly, like a coronation. No crown without witnesses, no ownership without belief. Bell stiffened but said nothing. Edward turned to Dr. Helena Weiss. You designed the protocol, Edward said. Explain it to me again, slowly. Weiss hesitated, then nodded. Her composure returned the moment she spoke in technical terms. This was her refuge. The artifact exists as a cryptographic entity, she said. Ownership is transferred by generating a new private key, derived from a multi-party computation. No single participant ever sees the full key. The system assembles it transiently, then destroys the intermediate states. Edward nodded. And when does the new owner receive control? Edward asked. At the end of verification, Weiss replied. At the end of verification. Edward glanced at the empty air. After the blackout, he said. Yes, Weiss said. Edward paused. Unless, he said, consensus has already been achieved. The room reacted as one. That's impossible, Weiss said sharply. The protocol prevents. Prevention assumes honesty and isolation. He turned to Leonard Cho. Mr. Cho, how many private auctions have you audited? Cho shifted his weight. Dozens, hundreds if you count advisory work. Edward nodded. And how many failed because of cryptography? Edward asked. Cho frowned. Very few. Edward smiled faintly. And how many failed because of people? Edward asked. Cho did not answer. Edward returned to the table and rested his palm flat against its surface. The interface was inactive now, its light subdued, waiting for instructions that would never come. Consensus, Edward said. In systems like this, consensus is not a vote, it's a condition. He looked at Weiss. What constitutes consensus in your protocol? Edward asked. Weiss swallowed. All parties must authenticate their intent, biometric confirmation, behavioral confirmation, temporal alignment. Edward nodded. And what happens if one party authenticates early? Edward asked. Weiss frowned. The system waits. Edward nodded again. And if one party authenticates late? Weiss hesitated. The system compensates to maintain alignment. Edward wrote a note. Compensation.
Edward addressed the group. Consensus protocols are designed to prevent theft. They are not designed to prevent anticipation. Bell leaned forward. You're suggesting someone predicted the outcome. Edward shook his head. No, he said. I'm suggesting someone confirmed it. Edward turned to Isabella Moreau. You were bidding aggressively until the last minute. Moreau's eyes flashed. Because I wanted it. Edward nodded. And Klein wanted you to know that. Her expression tightened. Edward continued. Klein didn't need to win the auction. He needed you to believe he already had.
Cho frowned. That doesn't make sense. Edward looked at him. It makes perfect sense, Edward said, if the value isn't the artifact, but the reaction. Edward paced slowly, letting the idea breathe. Klein was a first mover, Edward said. He understood markets. More importantly, he understood people who thought they understood markets. He stopped near Klein's body. Klein knew, Edward said, that one of you had already compromised the protocol. Weiss's head snapped up. That's not possible, she said. I would have known. Edward nodded. Eventually, he said. Edward looked at Cho. You specialize in identifying edge cases, Edward said, places where systems behave unexpectedly under pressure. Cho's jaw tightened. Edward pressed on. The private key was never stolen tonight, Edward said. It was reconstructed before tonight. Bell shook his head. There was no exposure. Edward nodded. No exposure, he said, just repetition. Edward explained carefully, step by step, without jargon. Multi-party computation relies on fragments, Edward said. Each participant contributes something meaningless on its own. Weiss nodded reluctantly. But people, Edward continued, are not machines. They repeat behaviors, they reuse timing, they apply patterns unconsciously. He looked at Weiss again. You reuse salts, Edward said. Weiss stiffened. Within acceptable parameters, she said. Edward nodded. And Victor Klein noticed, Edward said. Weiss's face drained of color. Edward continued gently. He noticed because he was looking for it, Edward said. He wasn't trying to steal the key. He was trying to see if it could be stolen. Cho exhaled sharply. Jesus, he muttered. Edward turned back to the table. Klein didn't come here to bid, Edward said. He came to confirm ownership. Bell frowned. Ownership of what? Edward looked up. Of certainty, he said. He let that settle. When the lights went out, Edward said, Klein realized something. He gestured to the space above the table. He realized the artifact wasn't waiting to be transferred. It was already gone. Moreau's breath caught. Edward nodded. And someone else realized that Klein had realized it. Edward reconstructed the blackout again, this time through cognition rather than motion. The lights go out. No one can see, but people feel. A hand tightens, a breath stops, a body leans in. Edward looked at Moreau. You screamed first, Edward said, not because you saw a body. Her eyes widened. You screamed, Edward continued, because you saw Klein's face in the moment the lights returned. She shook her head. You're guessing. Edward shook his head. I'm observing sequence, he said. He turned to Cho. You didn't react immediately, Edward said, because you already knew. Cho swallowed. Edward turned to Weiss. You froze, Edward said, because the system behaved exactly as it shouldn't. Weiss closed her eyes. Edward drew the final line. The key was reconstructed weeks ago, Edward said, using repeated interactions, predictable timing, and one overlooked assumption that humans don't leak information unless they mean to. He looked around the room. The blackout was not for theft, Edward said again. It was for revelation. Silence pressed in. Bell spoke finally. And the murder? He asked quietly. Edward answered without hesitation. The murder, he said, was to erase the first witness to certainty. He glanced down at Klein. He died because he knew who owned the artifact. And who was that? Moreau whispered. Edward did not answer yet. He closed his notebook. That, Edward said, comes next.
Chapter 4. Ownership. Edward Hale had waited deliberately before speaking the word. Ownership. It was a dangerous word. People reacted to it more viscerally than to guilt or motive. Guilt could be argued. Motive could be rationalized. Ownership, once challenged, threatened identity itself. Edward stood at the edge of the vault's light, letting the silence do its work. The 4 remaining bidders sat or stood in the same positions, but they no longer felt equal. Hierarchies had begun to emerge, not of wealth or status, but of control. Ownership, Edward said at last, is not possession. Isabella Moreau's laugh cut through the quiet, brittle and sharp. "Spare us the philosophy," she said. "This is about a key, a digital one." Edward nodded. "It is," he said, "which makes the confusion understandable." He stepped closer to the table. "In the physical world," Edward continued, "ownership is enforced by proximity. You lock something away, you guard it, you touch it." He tapped the table lightly with his knuckles. "In the digital world," he said, "ownership is enforced by exclusivity of knowledge." Dr. Helena Weiss shifted in her seat. Edward turned to her. "You designed the protocol to ensure that no single person ever knew the full key," Edward said, "correct?" "Yes," Weiss replied. "That was the point." Edward nodded. "And yet," he said, "someone did." Arthur Bell leaned forward, his voice low. "You're suggesting the system failed, that the protocol was compromised." Edward looked at him calmly. "No," he said, "I'm suggesting the protocol succeeded." Bell frowned. "That's a contradiction." Edward shook his head. "It's a misunderstanding," he said. "The protocol did exactly what it was designed to do. It prevented unauthorized access. It did nothing to prevent unauthorized certainty." Leonard Cho exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "You're saying someone knew the key without ever holding it," Cho said. Edward nodded. "Yes." "That's not how cryptography works," Cho said. He met his gaze. "It is," Edward said, "when the cryptography depends on human behavior." Edward turned to Weiss. "Your system relies on multi-party computation," Edward said. "Each participant contributes entropy, timing, pressure, biometric noise." Weiss shifted in her seat. "To make prediction impossible," Edward continued. "To make reconstruction impossible," she corrected. Edward allowed the distinction. "Except," he said, "humans don't generate true randomness." Weiss stiffened. "Within tolerances." "Within comfort," Edward interrupted gently. He continued before she could respond. "People repeat," Edward said. "They reuse habits, rhythms, micro-delays. They press harder when nervous, slower when confident." He looked at her carefully. "And you," Edward said, "are very confident." The color drained slightly from Weiss's face. Edward began to pace again, slow and deliberate. "Victor Klein understood this," Edward said. "He didn't need the key. He needed to know who had it." Isabella scoffed. "That's meaningless." Edward stopped and faced her. "Is it?" he asked. She held his gaze. "If I know who controls an asset, I don't need to own it. I can trade on the knowledge. I can threaten exposure. I can provoke reactions." He gestured toward Klein's body. "And Klein did," Edward said. "He provoked." Edward reconstructed Klein's strategy aloud. "He attended multiple private auctions," Edward said. "He watched timing. He observed behavior. He noticed that one participant, always the same, introduced subtle predictability." Weiss swallowed. "Klein ran simulations," Edward said. "Not on the protocol, on the people." Cho's voice was tight. You're saying he identified a single weak link? Edward nodded. He identified ownership before it was declared. Edward turned to Isabella Moreau again. You bid aggressively, Edward said, not to win, but to force a response. Her eyes narrowed. From whom? Edward gestured around the room. From the one person who couldn't afford for you to win, Edward said. Isabella's lips parted slightly. Edward continued. Klein watched reactions, Edward said. Micro-delays, breathing changes, adjustments in posture. He paused, and he figured it out. Arthur Bell leaned back, troubled. If someone already owned the artifact, Bell said, why kill Klein? Edward answered immediately. Because certainty changes behavior, he said. Klein came here intending to expose the truth. The blackout wasn't his idea, but he knew it would force the issue. Edward looked at Cho. Klein expected panic, Edward said. What he didn't expect was speed. Cho said nothing. Edward turned to Weiss. Klein realized it the moment the lights went out, Edward said, because the system behaved as if consensus had already been reached. Weiss closed her eyes. Edward pressed on. And someone else realized that Klein had realized, Edward said. That's when the decision was made. Edward lowered his voice. The murder was not planned weeks ago, he said. The theft was. The room felt suddenly colder. The blackout created an unobservable moment, Edward said. Not for hacking, for acting. He gestured toward the table's underside. A small device, Edward said, non-lethal in design, capable of inducing cardiac arrest through precise electrical discharge. No marks, no residue. Legal to possess in several jurisdictions. Bell inhaled sharply. Cho's face hardened. Edward looked directly at him. You know exactly what I'm describing, Edward said. Cho did not deny it. Edward let the implication hang. Ownership, Edward said, was decided long before tonight. He turned to Weiss. You designed the protocol, Edward said, but you did not own the artifact. Weiss shook her head weakly. Edward turned to Bell. You facilitated the auction, Edward said, but you did not own it. Bell nodded slowly. Edward turned to Moreau. You wanted it, Edward said, but wanting is not owning. Moreau's jaw tightened. Edward finally turned to Cho. And you, Edward said, already had it. Silence. Cho's eyes flicked toward the sealed door, then back to Edward. That's absurd. If I owned it, why would I be here? Edward answered calmly. Because you wanted to see if anyone else knew, he said. Cho said nothing. Edward stepped closer. You killed Klein not to steal the artifact. You killed him because he forced you to reveal yourself. Cho's breathing changed. Edward continued. And in 10 seconds of darkness, Edward said, you chose certainty over discretion. Edward straightened. Ownership is not about possession. It's about who panics when ownership is threatened. He looked around a room one last time. And tonight, Edward said, only one of you panicked. He closed his notebook. That leaves one chapter.
Chapter 5. The Lie of Wealth. Wealth had a sound. Edward Hale had learned to recognize it long before he ever stood in rooms like this one. It was not the clink of glasses or the murmur of expensive voices. It was quieter, a faint, persistent confidence that rules would bend, that consequences would soften, that reality itself was negotiable if enough money leaned on it. The vault was full of that sound now. Leonard Cho sat very still, hands resting flat on the table, as if he were afraid that any movement might be interpreted as flight. His face was composed, but Edward could see the strain beneath it, the minute tension in the jaw, the careful control of breath. Cho was not panicking. That would have been easier. He was calculating. Edward did not rush him. Confessions born from pressure were theatrical. Confessions born from inevitability were useful. Let's be clear, Edward said quietly.
This is no longer about whether the artifact was stolen. Arthur Bell shifted in his chair. Then what is it about? Edward turned slightly toward him. It's about why Victor Klein had to die, Edward said, and why the person responsible believed they could afford the consequences. Bell frowned. Isabella Moreau watched Edward closely now, her earlier aggression replaced by something sharper, interest. Edward continued. Leonard, Edward said, using Cho's first name for the first time, you are very good at reading systems. Cho did not respond. You understand how they fail, Edward went on. More importantly, you understand how people behave when they believe a system is protecting them. Cho's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. Edward took a slow step closer. You didn't break the protocol, Edward said. You didn't hack anything. You didn't steal a key in the conventional sense. He paused. You waited. Cho finally spoke. You're describing foresight, he said. That's not a crime. Edward nodded. No, he said, it isn't. He looked down at Victor Klein's body, then back up. But killing someone who realizes your foresight is, Edward said. Edward reconstructed the final moments aloud, not as accusation, but as narrative. People listened differently when they were invited into a story. Klein came here knowing the auction was already decided, not publicly, not contractually, but mathematically. Weiss closed her eyes. He knew, Edward continued, that your repeated participation in similar auctions had given you enough data to reconstruct the private key probabilistically. Cho's voice was flat. You're overstating. Edward raised a hand gently. You didn't reconstruct the key perfectly, Edward said. You didn't need to. You narrowed the possibilities to a point where ownership was no longer uncertain. That was enough. He turned slightly, including the others. In markets like this, Edward said, certainty is more valuable than possession. If you know the outcome before anyone else, you can behave as if you already own the result. Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So he was trading on knowledge, not the asset. Edward nodded. Exactly. Edward faced Cho again. Klein, Edward said, his voice calm and precise, realized this during the blackout, not because of something you did, but because of something you felt. Cho laughed softly. That's ridiculous. Edward did not smile. When the lights went out, Edward said, you didn't move to steal anything. You moved to confirm that no one else was moving. Cho's eyes flickered. You listened, Edward said, for panic, for hesitation, for confirmation that you were still alone in your certainty. Edward leaned slightly forward. And Klein saw it on your face the moment the lights came back on. Silence. Edward continued. Klein smiled, Edward said, not broadly, just enough. He gestured subtly, mirroring the expression. That smile told you everything, Edward said. It told you he knew. And once he knew, your advantage was gone. Cho swallowed. The device, Edward said, his voice calm and precise, you brought as a contingency. You didn't plan to use it tonight. Cho shook his head. You can't prove. Edward cut him off, gently, but firmly. No, Edward said, I can't. He straightened. But proof isn't what matters here. Arthur Bell stiffened. Then what does? Edward looked at him.
What matters, Edward said, is that banks hate uncertainty more than crime. Bell did not respond. Edward turned back to Cho. You assumed, Edward said, that this room would protect you, that the vault, the bank, the money surrounding you would absorb the consequences. Cho's voice cracked for the first time. That's how the world works. Edward nodded. Often, he said, but not always. Edward gestured toward the table. The blackout gave you 10 seconds, Edward said, not to act, but to decide. He lowered his voice.
You chose to act, Edward said. Cho looked at the floor. It was an accident, Cho said quietly. I didn't mean to... Edward shook his head. No, he said, it wasn't. Cho looked up, eyes burning. You don't know... Edward's voice remained steady. You applied the device with precision, Edward said. You knew where to place it. You knew how long it would take. You knew it would leave no trace. Cho slumped back in his chair. That wasn't panic, Edward said. That was preparation. The room felt different now, not tense, resolved. Arthur Bell exhaled slowly. What happens next? He asked. Edward answered without hesitation. You call the authorities, Edward said. You report a death during a private auction. You disclose the theft. Bell's expression hardened. That would destroy... Edward looked at him. It will wound you, Edward said, but covering it up would destroy you. Bell stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Cho spoke again, his voice hollow. I'll cooperate. Edward regarded him. I know, Edward said. You always do when the cost-benefit analysis changes. Cho flinched. Edward stepped back, giving space. This case was never about technology, Edward said to the room, or art, or money. He glanced at Victor Klein one last time. It was about believing that wealth makes you untouchable, Edward said, that if you play the game well enough, the room itself will protect you. He shook his head. But locked rooms don't care who you are. They only care what you did. Edward closed his notebook. The auction is over, he said quietly. The vault remained sealed, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Outside, systems were already preparing to respond, slowly, carefully, with the practiced reluctance of institutions forced to acknowledge reality. Edward turned away from the table. Behind him, Leonard Cho finally bowed his head. The lie of wealth had collapsed, and it had only taken 10 seconds of darkness to reveal it. Epilogue. Immutable. The vault opened an hour later. Not because justice demanded it, but because procedures did. The doors slid apart with the same quiet authority they had displayed all evening, as if nothing irreversible had happened inside. Air from the upper levels flowed in, warmer, imperfect, carrying the faint traces of a city that did not care about private keys or sealed rooms. Edward Hale stepped out last. He did not look back. The official version of events formed quickly. It always did. A medical emergency during a private financial transaction, an unfortunate coincidence, an internal review pending. Arthur Bell delivered the statements with the precision of a man who understood language as damage control. Names were withheld, details were minimized. The words murder and theft were carefully avoided, replaced by terms that suggested ambiguity rather than intent. Edward watched from a distance as the narrative settled into place. It was clean. Not true, but clean enough. Leonard Cho was escorted out through a different corridor. Not in handcuffs. Not yet. Edward had insisted on that delay, not out of mercy, but out of accuracy. Men like Cho did not collapse under pressure. They unraveled under exposure. Letting him walk, knowing what waited beyond the vault, was its own form of confinement. As Cho passed Edward, he stopped. You didn't need to do this, Cho said quietly. You could have let them bury it. Edward met his eyes. They will, Edward said, just not with you inside it. Cho swallowed. You think this changes anything? Cho asked. The artifact will resurface. The market will move on. Edward nodded. Yes, he said. Markets always do. Cho frowned. Then what was the point? Edward answered without hesitation. So that one man wouldn't disappear quietly, he said. Cho looked away. Dr. Helena Weiss resigned 2 weeks later.
Her letter was short, technical, precise. It cited professional fatigue and philosophical differences. No mention was made of guilt or error or Victor Klein. Edward read the letter once and set it aside. Protocols would change, interfaces would be redesigned, entropy would be discussed more carefully in future papers. None of that would restore what had been lost. The artifact itself never appeared in public again. Officially, the transfer was voided due to irregularities. Unofficially, the private key was rendered useless, fractured, distributed, locked behind layers of legal and technical dispute that ensured no single entity could claim it cleanly. Edward suspected that someone, somewhere, still had enough fragments to believe they owned it. Belief, after all, was harder to erase than access. Weeks later, Edward sat in a quiet cafe scrolling through the news on his phone. A small article caught his attention. Private NFT sale canceled amid security review. No names, no numbers, no mention of a body on a vault floor. Edward closed the article. Truth did not require headlines. It required memory. That night, Edward opened his notebook. He turned past pages filled with sealed rooms, silent labs, systems that failed only when humans trusted them too much. He found a blank page and wrote the title carefully. The Closed Auction. Below it, he added a single line. In darkness, ownership reveals itself. Edward closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, the city glowed. Servers humming, transactions settling, digital ledgers updating themselves with perfect indifference. Blockchains were immutable. People were not. Edward turned off the light. Somewhere, a system believed it had concluded a transaction. Edward knew better. The transaction had been human, and it would echo.
The lights went out for 10 seconds. That was enough. If you want more modern detective stories where crimes hide behind wealth, technology, and human behavior, subscribe to the channel. The next case is already locked.